I was born double-fisting two gifts that were not highly esteemed in my world: curiosity and creativity. My parents had enough to do keeping food on the table. They couldn't give me the attention or opportunities I craved. And our little New Jersey town was a great place to be a kid so long as you conformed to all of the kids. In many ways, it wasn't a bad place to grow up, but I never really felt like I found my place there. No one thought like I did, wanted to ponder the questions I wanted to ponder, or wanted to deal with the trouble I got into when I just wanted to know something. Curiosity and creativity got me into plenty of trouble, but it was a self inflicted trauma, so to speak, that really defined my consciousness as a child. It happened on a Christmas Eve midnight mass at our Catholic church. The priest uttered some simple words of faith, but again, things rarely stay simple with me. His kingdom will have no end, the priest said. He came to give us everlasting life, and a world without end, amen. He ended by saying amen, which means so be it. But that was not what I was feeling. The priest's words introduced to me a concept of eternity, and it broke my fragile mind. I remember the drive home. It was quiet cold, and I was hiding, curled in a ball, on the floorboard of the car, reeling uncontrollably from the thought of the vast cold infinite. Most people I have met since then think that heaven is a place of happiness and joy. To me, heaven meant slowly going insane. 1,000,000 years from now, I would still exist. 1,000,000,000,000 years. An eon. Though I didn't understand the terms of time at that age, I still understood the concept. If there was no end, there can be no middle. If there's no middle, then there is only the perpetual beginning. 1,000,000,000,000 eons from now, to the 10th power, I would still only be beginning my existence. I looked into the vast, cold void of beyond time, and it shattered me. It wasn't just the vastness that got to me. It was thinking that I would eventually do everything with that kind of time. What would I do with the rest of eternity once I had accomplished everything many times over? It seemed more like a prison than a paradise. It's kind of heavy for a 4-year-old. That fear haunted my youth. I turned my unquenchable inquisitive and my unending inventiveness into a drive to bury myself in anything that could distract me from the inevitability of my eternity. Since nobody else appeared to fear the existence of a never-ending nothing left to do, I felt alone in my anxieties. And so, I retreated into my imagination. I began to look at the world like an anthropologist, or rather, like a foreigner studying a new world he hopes to make his own. I began to notice how my parents would react differently to me depending on my mood or my tone, or how my reactions to something would change over the course of an interaction. They might indulge my childish questions at first, but if I kept pressing, they would cease to find them cute and become irritated. In the same way, I began to notice that I could change their reactions by changing my own behavior. It was almost like I had a superpower, watching them come close to yelling me, only to change direction in the last moment. It felt good to have some kind of control over my world. During this time, I created my first suits and bubbles. They gave me a way to study my experiences, and even to experiment with different emotions and behaviors. My first suits were crude, like smearing paint on myself and calling it happy or sorry. The bubbles developed as settings for me to role play while wearing a suit. I called them bubbles because when I spread them out before me, in my mind's eye, I pictured them like little translucent spheres floating around me. Within each one, I created environments and placed circumstances that I wished to work through. The bubble could be a room, a world, or even a universe. There were no boundaries or limitations. There were little laboratories for studying this thing called being human. I might create a bubble that looked like my kitchen while I was physically sitting in my room, say. Then I would roleplay trying to get a cookie from my mother as an afternoon snack, putting on suits that were confident or pitiful or flattering. I didn't always have the words for these things. That's why I made the suits. They visually stood in for ways of being that I couldn't articulate any other way. Then I would take the results of my little play and take them out into the world. One memory that looms large in my past, for instance, involves an afternoon where my grandmother was watching my brother and me while my parents were at work. She had a bad habit of watching her telenovelas at the right time I was watching DuckTales. On this particular afternoon, on the bus ride home, I spent some of the time in a bubble rehearsing some strategies to get control of the TV. Now, my normal impulse was to fuss and complain and generally be a little prick, but I knew that could land me in my room. I ran the scene where I went outside and scraped my knee with a rock. I rejected that one. Granny, I imagined, would clean my wound, possibly scold me for going outside when I was supposed to be inside, and then put me to bed to rest up. Or worse, she might set me on the couch with her to watch her stories with her. In the next bubble, I engaged in a conversation about my school day while casually turning the television to DuckTales. No good. She would just take the control and flip back the channel. I faked a phone call by handing her the kitchen phone while I went and picked the living room phone up and pretended to be a business person. But that was a multi-flawed idea. I tried telling her she could go home because I was a man and I didn't need anyone watching me. I was old enough to watch my older brother and me. She laughed and flipped to Telemundo. Next. I even considered telling the truth, that DuckTales was coming on, and I never missed an episode. I deemed that too risky, as she could still pull rank as an adult. I needed something guaranteed. Then, my stomach began to rumble, and I thought about food, and it hit me. Milanese. It was perfect. Milanese is a South American dish of thin meat fillets breaded and fried. Incredibly tasty. I ran the situation in a bubble. It would take at least a half hour to prepare, bread, and cook the meat along with the rice she normally makes with it. If I came home from school complaining about how I lost my lunch money and wasn't able to eat at school and needed nourishment, then collapsed for dramatic effect, then not only would the meal preparation keep her tied up in the kitchen during DuckTales, but at the end of the episode, I would have Milanese. Let's just say it was delicious. Sometimes deploying a bubble strategy required delayed gratification, something people struggle with into adulthood. I had learned a form of it in my childhood because I knew if I pushed my luck too hard or too quickly, I probably wouldn't get what I wanted. If I had been a brat in the store and saw a toy I wanted, I would become helpful and polite for as long as I could, and at the appropriate moment, roll the dice and see if I could reap the reward of having turned my behavior around. Okay, sometimes I would break out the puppy dog eyes. I was still a little kid. But I learned from a young age that literally changing my attitude, which was adults were telling me to do, could often get me what I wanted better than dealing with the setting of being a little prick. And playing with my suits was more exciting than changing my attitude, whatever that meant. I was about 8 years old when my grandmother first called me Jaimito. In English, that's Little Jimmy, the Beaner version of Little Johnny. You know, the little bastard. Well, okay, that was me. I mean, I was a little bastard in a manner of speaking, but I wasn't a bastard out of sheer bastarddom. In truth, it was because I had begun asking questions that were received as insolent rather than the merely inquisitive and terrified spirit they were meant. You start asking people questions about God, death, and the afterlife, or the human spirit, questions they don't have answers for, and they can start to get defensive, even angry. Things weren't better for me at school. For instance, I was never really great at reading because I found it frustratingly difficult to think and be still at the same time. I operated best in motion. But if I was moving, it was difficult to read. However, I was a natural audio learner. In fact, I've always been a quick learner. But from the perspective of the school system, I was a terrible student. Back then, there were no attempts to accommodate different learning styles. What to me was a mean to channel my excess energy was for my teacher a huge distraction. I had to adapt or fail. So I learned to expel a lot of my surplus energy in my imagination. In my third grade year at Holy Innocents, we began to have an hour-long religious studies class each day. I hated it. The rest of the class seemed happy enough because we learned about Jesus and it wasn't a hard class. For me, however, it was an agonizing hour with no help at all of avoiding the eternal thought. Quite the opposite, in fact. That's when I learned to become a daydreamer. They called me a daydreamer anyway, which was their way of saying I was a bad student. In fact, I was only doing in the classroom what I would usually do in my room, creating bubbles and running scenes with my suits. Maybe I should have run a scenario to see what would happen if I stopped paying attention in class, but I guess it didn't feel important enough. School never tried to answer any of my big questions, not even in religious studies class.